In June of 1950, Police Captain Hubert V. Rhyme would be assigned what would turn out to be the most peculiar case of his career. The body of an unknown man who had been struck down by a car in Times Square had just been delivered to the morgue. Upon his arrival to inspect the unfortunate man, Rhyme immediately noted the odd way in which he was dressed. He wore cotton check trousers, a short jacket of an unusual cut, and a light grey waistcoat. The collar of his shirt was pressed upright, and oddly, his shoes were fastened with buttons instead of laces. To top off his look, he wore a stovepipe-style hat atop his head. Altogether, it led to the impression that he had styled himself on the late fashion of the Victorian era. Although odd, this wasn't in itself all that perplexing. For every era, there have been people who have dared to stand out and dress in a fashion contrary to that of the time. No, for Rhyme, it was what the man had on his person at the time of his death that was truly puzzling. He had nearly $70 in cash, made up largely of old-style banknotes instead of bills. The few coins he had looked almost untouched, but none were dated newer than 1876. Among these coins was a 3-cent piece that was no longer in circulation or use of any kind. He also carried a bill from a livery stable for the maintenance of a carriage and the caring of a horse, as well as a coin worth 5 cents from a local saloon that no one had heard of. However, most useful to Rhyme were a few business cards and a letter, both marked with a name. Presumably that of the man himself, Rudolf Fentz. The letter was marked to be delivered to an address on 5th Avenue, the same address printed on the business cards. This was a lead, one that Rhyme was sure would put this to bed quickly. Upon arriving at the address, it became apparent to Rhyme that something was amiss. For one, the building was a commercial lot and not a residential premises as noted by the letter. And secondly, the owners of the building had never heard of a Rudolf Fentz and claimed to have owned the building for a number of years. Frustrated, but not yet defeated, Rhyme redirected his attention to the circumstances of Fentz's accident, hoping to unearth some further clues. After some questioning, he was able to piece together this timeline of events. Although no one had seen where Fentz had come from, he was first observed standing around in the street at around 11 p.m. He seemed dazed and not fully with it. He was staring at the buildings and streetlights, but he seemed most intrigued by the cars passing by. Some bystanders thought he was inebriated, while others simply assumed that his odd behaviour was down to him being new to city life. A few moments passed, and with a change in the lights, cars began to move ahead of him. Instead of waiting on the sidewalk for a gap in traffic like everyone else, Fentz made a mad dash across the street, a momentary choice which would lead him to be struck down almost immediately. By the time anyone had run to his aid, Fentz had died, killed instantly in the collision. Unfortunately for Rhyme, the information he had just uncovered seemed to ask more questions than he had answered. Where had Fentz come from? What was the cause of his unusual behaviour? It seemed likely that he was drunk, but this didn't sit well with Rhyme at all. Every sensible hypothesis he would come up with was fraught with holes. When it soon became apparent that no one was going to come forward to identify the missing man, Rhyme doubled down on the investigation. He worked his way through a back catalogue of phone books, searching for a Fentz family. The name was relatively unusual and so wouldn't crop up often. After some time, he found the address of a Rudolf Fentz Jr. in a phone book dated to 1939. After questioning the building manager, he discovered that Fentz Jr. had moved out in 1942, when he was in his 60s and had just retired from a long career at a local bank. Unfortunately for Rhyme, Fentz Jr. had died in 1945, but he did leave behind a widow who had moved to Florida after her husband's passing. Still unsure if this Fentz Jr. had anything to do with the man who had shown up in the morgue just a few weeks before, Rhyme decided to reach out to Fentz Jr.'s widow, inquiring about his life. What she would tell him would lead Rhyme to an extraordinary conclusion. Sometime in the 1870s, Fentz Jr.'s father, Rudolf Fentz, had left their family home for a late-night walk and a cigar, but he had never returned. The subsequent search for Fentz turned up nothing. It was as if he had just vanished into the night. Baffled by this discovery, Rhyme would return back to work in New York, and after some further digging, unearthed the missing persons case from 1876. That being of Rudolf Fentz. Last seen wearing check trousers, a short jacket, and a waistcoat with a distinctive dark brown hat. Rhyme would never report his findings to his superiors, for seemingly obvious reasons. He did wish to keep his job after all. So, the case of Rudolf Fentz, peculiar in nature and twisting a narrative, was officially left unsolved. Was it really possible that Rudolf Fentz had been a man out of time? So, the peculiar tale of Rudolf Fentz, fact or fiction? We'll keep it short this time around because there's not too much to go over. The tale of Rudolf Fentz first appears to have gained popularity in the 70s and 80s as a creepy, strange but true style of urban legend. But it wouldn't take off truly until the dawn of the internet age in the late 90s. By the early 2000s, the story was being widely circulated on a number of websites, many of which reported on the tale as if it were a real case. It turns out, however, that the story of Rudolf Fentz is exactly that, a story. The tale of Fentz's fate is actually a sub-story, part of a collection of short science fiction tales written by author Jack Finney, first published in 1951. The story is presented as a dialogue between two characters, one, an older man, and the other, a retired police captain named Hubert V. Rime. Some people have since refuted this claim, often citing a newspaper article that supposedly predates the short story itself. However, these claims have largely been discredited. It would seem then that the mystery has since been put to bed, and that, in fact, it has actually been solved.